Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to see so many friends and colleagues in the room. I'm delighted to be at the Morton Arboretum. All the interactions I've had over the past 10 years or so have been really wonderful. It's a fantastic, inspirational place to visit, and I'm now delighted to be surrounded by the world's leading oak experts and enthusiasts. So brilliant, and I know it's going to be a really exciting week. So my talk tonight is about saving trees from extinction, and that's quite a big task, but I think we all have an important part to play. One of the most iconic of the world's threatened tree species is the monkey puzzle tree, Araucaria araucana, which is native to Chile and Argentina. And last week, en route to the Morton Arboretum, I was fortunate to spend some time in Argentina, in Chile, apologies, and I visited the monkey puzzle trees for the first time, and I really felt like a tree hugger. It was so exciting to see monkey puzzles growing in their native habitat, an endangered species, an iconic tree. And that's how I am used to seeing monkey puzzle trees growing in people's front gardens in the UK. Many trees that are really quite common in cultivation are in trouble in the wild, and I think quite broadly people don't realise about the threats that some of our trees that we all love and recognise are really on the endangered list. So, Araucaria araucana, the magnificent monkey puzzle tree, ginkgo biloba, so common as a street tree, very commonly cultivated in botanic gardens and arboreta around the world, endangered in the wild in China. Davidia, the handkerchief or dove tree, again very common in cultivation, but vulnerable in the wild in China. Magnolia wilsonii, a beautiful species, again on the IUCN red list. And Camellia nitidissima, a species which is critically endangered in the wild in China. So all these beautiful tree species that we see in our garden collections are facing extinction in the wild. Other species that we maybe don't see so often are not familiar as garden plants. Zelkovia abelacea, critically endangered in Crete. Abies nebridensis, a fabulous conifer species that is restricted to Sicily and is endangered in the wild. And a species that we may never see in the wild unless we're very lucky, Wallemia nobilis, the Wallemi pine, really critically endangered. This species was only discovered in 1994. It's only known from one small gorge in Australia, but that is a species that we may well see in botanic garden collections. It is now well established in botanic garden collections, and as many of you may know, the actual release of that species, propagated plants of Wallemia, has been used to support conservation of the species in the wild. And that is not really the best way to conserve a tree species, but botanic gardens and arboreta really do have a very significant role to play in tree conservation. And people become very fond of the trees that they see in botanic garden collections. This tree, the Tambusu tree, Fragaria fragrans, is an iconic tree in the Singapore Botanic Garden. This is not a threatened tree species, but it is so iconic. It features on the Singaporean $5 note, and it is the tree at the site at which the independence was signed when Singapore became independent from Britain in 1959. So it's a tree where many Singaporeans go to become engaged or to celebrate their marriage. It's really a very iconic species. And I think that Botanic Gardens and Arboreta have a really important role to play in communicating the importance of plants and getting people to understand just how valuable trees are to us all and the threats they face. The Morton Arboretum, which we've all had the privilege to enjoy today and we'll do throughout the week, has a fantastic collection of trees, many of which are under threat in the wild. Quercus acerifolia, a species of oak that is probably familiar to the experts within the room. But what a wonderful specimen, and what a way to connect with the public and to explain to people that species like this, which are endangered in the wild, in this case, a species that's endemic to the Ozarks and known only from one state in the United States, to show people that this is an endangered species and there are options for its conservation to ensure the survival of these species. And even species which are not on the threatened list, what a way for Botanic Gardens to connect and inform people about their local tree flora and how important trees are. So I think that Botanic Gardens have a really fundamentally important role to play in saving trees from extinction. And in some cases, species would be extinct if it were not for the work of Botanic Gardens and their collections. The famous Franklin tree was actually discovered 250 years ago this year, restricted to Georgia in the United States, the very rare natural distribution, but within 40 years of its initial discovery and collection by the Bartrams, it was extinct in the wild. And the exact causes of that loss of the species are not known, not fully understood, but horticulture, collection of plants from the wild for horticulture, played a part in its decline. It was only known from a small area of acid bog, so naturally rare, but threatened. And that species would have been lost in the wild if it was not for the work of horticulturalists, and it is now very widely known and available within the Botanic Garden world. Another species extinct in the wild, Sophora toromiro, was known only from Rapa Nui or Easter Island off the coast of Chile, and this species became extinct in the wild in the 1950s, but the explorer Thor Heyerdahl took some cuttings from the last remaining tree back to Europe, and it's now in cultivation in around 20 botanic gardens worldwide. And there are plans to reintroduce it back into its native habitat, but of course the habitat has become degraded over the past 60 years or so, so it will be difficult, but I heard from colleagues in Chile last week that their efforts are ongoing to reintroduce this species. So some of these trees that are endangered in the wild have become iconic to us. Many of those species that I've shown will be familiar to people who work in botanic gardens and arboreta. The first stage in conserving trees is to understand what is at risk, which species are under threat, which species face extinction. And I think assessing the conservation status of tree species is a really important component of the conservation of the tree flora globally. So the IUCN Red List system is the sort of gold standard in assessment of the conservation status of species. The system was devised by Sir Peter Scott back in the 1960s, and Botanic Gardens became involved in red listing, assessing the conservation status of trees during the 1970s, and there are SSC, that's Species Survival Commission, groups that are devoted to red listing, and BGCI and RBGQ are members of the IUCN Red List Partnership. So they are helping to take forward the documentation of the threat status of tree species. And this is a really important first step in deciding what to conserve and coming up with conservation strategies. So currently there are around 10,000 tree species included in the IUCN Red List, of which 6,600 are threatened. So the IUCN Red List is the barometer of extinction, if you like. It records the conservation status of all species worldwide, and currently a quarter of the threatened species recorded by IUCN are trees. So there is a big job to do in conserving that number of tree species. The way that IUCN categorises the extinction risk of species is through a series of categories, and for all those brave people who came to the red listing workshop today, you will know all this, so I do not need to go through it again. But basically, there are three categories that indicate that a species is threatened with extinction: critically endangered, or vulnerable. And how do we decide on the threat status of a species? Well, a variety of sources of information is used. Basically, it's putting together the pieces of a jigsaw. Herbarium specimens, which have information on the distribution of species, a very valuable source of information. The literature, the published information, information recorded through GIS mapping to indicate the distribution of species in comparison to the distribution of forests and protected areas, remote sensing, fieldwork, and experts. And I think it's really important that all of us who know and love tree species contribute information as we can to support the assessment of those species and the threats they face in the wild. So IUCN has recorded about 6,600 tree species as threatened with extinction. In addition, a new survey by Botanic Gardens Conservation International has identified a further 3,000 tree species recorded as threatened in national red lists and similar conservation literature. So we know so far that 9,000 tree species face extinction, but we haven't assembled all the information. It's an ongoing challenge to understand exactly the extinction risk faced by trees. And we have this ambitious shared goal, conservation organisations working together globally on tree conservation, to produce a complete global assessment of woody plants by 2020. And that's a big challenge. We want to list all the world's tree species, and it still surprises me that there isn't one single consolidated list of the world's trees. We want to map all the world's trees and then apply the IUCN Red List categories and criteria. And then we can assess which species are in botanic garden collections, We can assess which species are already conserved within protected areas. We can look at the availability of material for restoring degraded areas. And we can use information on trees that are in trouble for forest management. Currently, about 10% of the world's tree species, 10% of the world's forest areas are managed sustainably according to forest certification schemes. But there's a lot of work to do to improve management of the world's forests, and using tree data will be really helpful for that. And why do we put all the emphasis on trees in conservation planning? Well, we all in this room love trees and understand their values, but I think it's really worth reminding people that around 25% of all plants are trees. And they have a huge value as timber species, for ornamentals, fuel, fibre, food and medicine, and a huge ecological value. Trees collectively produce nearly half the world's oxygen. They act in forests as carbon sinks, and they are a major structural part of our forest and terrestrial biomes. And they're needed to restore the world's degraded forests. We also want to red list, as part of the GlobalTree assessment, all the world's timber species, because timber trees contribute over $400 billion each year to the global economy. So they have a huge economic value and provide a huge contribution to carbon storage, nutrient and water cycling. And we don't know exactly what the conservation status is. So we have an ongoing PhD study to look at the world's timber species. Species like the big-leaved mahogany, which is currently assessed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List and of huge economic importance. And Pericopsis alata, a species, an African teak species, which is endangered with extinction, here growing in one of the arboreta in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we need to really understand what's happening to these timber resources as part of the GlobalTree assessment. And I really fundamentally believe that it's increasingly important to take action when we have the information on the threat status of tree species, when we have information from conservation assessments. We already know that 10% of the world's trees are threatened with extinction, and climate change is happening, and under climate change, trees can respond by migrating to appropriate environmental conditions, but can they do that quickly enough? They can adapt to environmental conditions, changing environmental conditions, but can they evolve quickly enough? Or they can become extinct, we can lose them. And that's a tragedy that I think we need to avoid. So when we have red list information, we can plan for action and we can really make efforts to conserve threatened tree species. We have produced over the past 12 years a series of red list reports. One, for example, on Magnoliaceae. This was published in 2007 and identified that half of the world's magnolias are under threat in the wild. And then BGCI can undertake surveys of the plants that are held in botanic gardens and arboretum worldwide and find out which species are in cultivation in botanic gardens, in documented collections, and which are not and need to be brought into collections for safeguarding for the future. This is a species of magnolia, Magnolia syrinthornii, which is endemic to Thailand, and is critically endangered and is not yet secure in conservation collections. So that is a priority for action. Another species of magnolia, Magnoliaceae stellata, is known from only 3 locations in China, and again is a priority for conservation action. And when we have that information, we can work in partnership with local botanic gardens to do further field work, to identify what needs to happen, to fill in the gaps in the data, and to plan for conservation of the species in their natural habitats as well as in botanic gardens. This is something that is an initiative going on for threatened plants around the world when we have that basic information on what the threats are and where the threatened species occur. Again, in the red list of Magnoliaceae, there are 7 endemic taxa of magnolia occurring in Cuba, all of which are under threat in the wild. And with that basic information, we can plan for conservation action and innovative solutions. So here is Luis Roberto Torres, who is a botanist at the Havana Botanic Garden, and he is collecting additional information on local populations of the Cuban magnolias and working with local coffee farmers to show them how to identify and propagate the magnolias and other tree species that are in trouble in the wild in Cuba, and developing local nurseries so that the species can be bulked up and then used in restoration projects. And this kind of work for magnolia conservation is going on in a range of different countries. There are projects in Colombia, projects in China, projects in Cuba, working with botanic gardens and with conservation agencies that are active in situ conservation. And similarly for maples, we produced a red list of maples published in 2009, and that has identified that around 25% of the world's maple species are under threat, and the iconic Acer pentaphyllum, which is quite well represented in botanic garden collections, is critically endangered in China, only known from 4 or 5 locations, threatened by hydroelectric dams, and the Quarry Hill Arboretum in California has decided to maintain a really well-planned ex situ collection because the experts there were so concerned about what was happening to the species in the wild. They wanted to influence local authorities within China to safeguard the species, but as a backup, they have Bill McNamara at the Quarry Hill Arboretum has developed a really good ex situ collection. And oaks, we all love oaks. A red list of oaks was produced in 2007. Thank you to many people here in the audience who contributed information for that publication, with around 500 oak taxa. Don't want to argue about the details with all of you oak experts, but let's say they're 500. We were only able to assess about less than half of the species at the time, but we identified the species that were under threat. And some of the species that you will all be familiar with, Quercus hintonii, I know that Alan Coombs and Maricela have worked on that species in the wild to find out exactly how threatened it is, a critically endangered species. Quercus georgiana, endangered, known only from from Alabama and Georgia, and now I believe extinct in South Carolina. So a US species that's endangered in the wild, and difficult to develop ex situ protocols for this species, but Valerie Pence, who I think is here, has been working on that species to see how to secure it in ex situ collections, because of course it's difficult to, if not impossible, to seed bank acorns. But I want to acknowledge the new global oak assessment, which is taking place, coordinated by the Morton Arboretum, part of the Morton Arboretum's major commitment to global tree conservation. And thank you to over 40 intrepid individuals who came to the oak red listing workshop today. It was very dynamic, and I don't think that slide completely does justice to all the energy that was in the room and the interactions and the sharing of information. So the Morton Arboretum has committed to doing an up-to-date global oak assessment and to collect information and red list the 500 or however many oak taxon there might turn out to be. And this is part of Morton's ongoing commitment to tree conservation, which is really impressive. The Morton Arboretum has 133 critically endangered and endangered trees growing, conserved within the grounds just over there. So, you know, what a hotspot for well-protected, well-curated endangered tree species, and a fantastic resource for research, for securing the long-term future of those species, and for informing the public about trees that are in trouble in the wild. And the Morton has a commitment to strengthening the conservation of collections, really, and also really sharing their expertise with botanic gardens and arboreta worldwide, and through ArbNet, which is an initiative that many of you will be familiar with, basically to certify the arboreta of the world, to show the standard that they have reached in a very accessible and friendly way. To reach level 4 of ArbNet certification, you have to demonstrate the work that you're doing in support of global tree conservation. And I wanted to show a slide of my neighbourhood botanic garden, if you like, the University Botanic Garden in Cambridge in the UK. And they are taking part in the ArbNet assessment. And I was meeting with the director and the curator last week, and they were saying, we want to get involved in global tree conservation. We want to reach ArbNet level 4, and it's provoking a conversation about what people can do. They have a very good collection of historically important trees. They have a fantastic botanic garden, basically, but now they're thinking, well, what can they do to contribute to global tree conservation? So this is the way that Morton has made other collections around the world think about what they can contribute over and above what they are already doing to maintain an excellent botanic garden. So botanic gardens have a hugely important role to play in tree conservation. They have documented collections of rare and threatened tree species. They have propagation skills, which are a fundamental component of most aspects of tree conservation. And they are increasingly involved in integrated conservation solutions, so helping to safeguard those trees in the wild and restore trees in the wild. But 74% of the world's most threatened tree species, those that are endangered or critically endangered, are not within botanic gardens, arboreta, or seed bank collections. So we need to think about the future of those species, and much more support is needed in countries with the most tree diversity and limited botanic garden resources. If you look at the global distribution of botanic gardens, all those little black fungal growths on the map are botanic gardens, and the majority are concentrated in Europe and North America. And the world's plant diversity is highlighted by the background colours. So the lurid pink is where the majority of plant diversity occurs. The hotspots in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and the slightly cooler hotspots in blue in Africa. And there are not so many fabulous Morton Arboretum, Kew Gardens, Cambridge Botanic Gardens, or equivalent in those countries where the threats to tree diversity are the greatest. So we need to find ways to collaborate and support botanic gardens in those countries. In East Africa, in Kenya, this is the Kakamega forest, which is a very biodiverse forest, very well known for its bird diversity, has a huge important tree diversity as well, surrounded by tea plantations and surrounded by forest destruction, burning, timber cutting, fuel wood extraction. So it's really, really important to support the botanic gardens in East Africa. The Turu Botanical Gardens in Uganda is a fabulous place if anyone has the opportunity to visit. It's a really community-based botanic garden where they are supporting all sorts of initiatives, including tree restoration, involving local community in propagating trees that can be sold for restoration, can be incorporated into community gardens. Trees that are selected by local people because of their value. This is a plantation of Prunus africana, actually within the grounds of the Turu Botanical Gardens. Prunus africana is a hugely valuable medicinal tree, the bark of which is extracted and traded globally more than any other medicinal bark, and usually it's removed from the wild in an unsustainable way, and so the trees are destroyed. This is such a valuable commodity, and botanic gardens can help to provide trees of that species for local communities to grow within their own land and have a source of income for the future. Another botanic garden in Uganda is the Nature Palace Botanic Garden, again where the local community is very much involved in deciding which trees should be grown and propagated. They've formed a small local cooperative to sell products from some of the trees that are supplied by the botanic garden, and then to sustainably develop their livelihoods. Another botanic garden in Kenya this time is the Brackenhurst Arboretum, which has an amazing restoration program showing that over 20 years the native forest can be restored and provide the same level of ecosystem services. So it's actually within 20 years you can see an increase in the bird fauna, you can see an increase in fresh water, and so they're doing a really fantastic job in demonstrating the value of the local trees. These initiatives are all coordinated by the Global Trees campaign, or the GTC. It's well worth looking at the website, and this is a joint initiative of BGCI and FFI, as Jerry has already mentioned, and some really fantastic projects with iconic species. This is Adansonia grandidierii from the southwest of Madagascar, and a species that's vulnerable in the wild, but working with local communities. There are initiatives to sustainably utilize the resources from that species and also replant it back into its native habitats. So it is becoming a conservation success story. And one of the new initiatives that the Morton Arboretum is planning and developing as part of the Global Trees campaign is a new initiative to conserve oaks in Mexico. And I think this is a really exciting future activity, and Alan Coombs will recognise that slide, I'm sure. But conserving Mexican oaks is going to be a really important new component of the Global Trees campaign. So I've tried to illustrate some of the species that are under threat in the wild, some of the ways to help secure those species, the future of those species. Botanic gardens and arboreta have a hugely important role to play. Also, we need to ensure that the species are protected in their natural habitats. That's the ultimate goal. And what can we do? What can we do to save tree species? First of all, I think we just need to love trees, be enthusiastic about them. I think we should support the work of botanic gardens and arboreta, which are doing a fantastic job, where they have good conservation programs. I want to make a plea for people to contribute information from their fields, surveys and knowledge of trees in the wild for the Global Tree Assessment. We need to expand and improve the ex situ collections of globally threatened tree species, and we really need to strengthen partnerships for in situ conservation, restoration and sustainable use. So there's a huge amount of work to do, but I think it's amazing what a group of committed individuals like the International Oak Society, like the Botanic Garden community, like the enthusiasts who have an interest in particular groups of trees can do. So I think working collectively with all those organisations, with all those acronyms, we really can secure a future and save threatened trees from extinction. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.